Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, KBRA's Head of European Research, Gordon Kerr, gives an overview of climate-related developments during COP27. The 27th Annual Conference of the Parties, COP27, concluded on Friday, November 18th. This year's event, held in Egypt, took place as many global challenges continue to unfold and become more severe, including the Russian-Ukraine war, rising inflation, and global energy shortages. Gordon and I talk about key developments from the proceedings, including the tense discussions around international climate finance, icy relations between China and the US, and the fossil fuel interests present at COP27. Hello to all of our listeners. This is Emilie Nadler, a director on KBRA's ESG team. Thanks so much, Gordon, for joining me to discuss all of the interesting happenings at COP27 this year. Just to set the stage for our listeners, COP27 took place at a bit of a tumultuous time. Extreme weather has caused catastrophic damage across the globe this year, including heat waves and drought throughout much of Europe over the summer, devastating floods in Pakistan, drought and flooding in China, and hurricanes in the US and Caribbean, among other events. The Russian-Ukraine war has also been putting pressure on global energy supplies and sparking fears of a retreat back to fossil fuels as Europe works to achieve energy security. So a lot for world leaders to tackle this year. Gordon, I want to just start off at a pretty broad level and discuss kind of some of the key themes of this year's climate summit. Can you walk us through some of the topics that were highlighted this year?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Emily. I would break it down into three main themes that really emerged. One is renewable energy, of course, given the situation as you highlighted, climate financing, and methane. Climate financing was a key theme in the lead up to the event, as well as during the proceedings. As you mentioned, severe climate events have been on the rise and have had especially devastating effects in the developing world. And there is growing demand for the developed world to help pay for their share of the loss and damage. On the renewable energy side of things, energy security has been a key theme. The Russia-Ukraine war has pushed the topic of energy security into the spotlight, and rising energy prices are stoking fears for the winter ahead in Europe. The US and Germany agreed to a deal with Egypt that the countries hope will speed up Egypt's climate planning and reliance on natural gas, while also exporting gas resources to Germany as it works to decrease reliance on Russia. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced during the event that with the new tapped gas resources, the country will succeed in becoming energy independent by 2045. Nuclear energy, which is a hot topic, was also promoted as a viable, low greenhouse gas emitting alternative to fossil fuels. Then turning to the final key theme was methane emissions, which was a key focus at COP26. Canada and the US said that they will work together to cut back on North American methane emissions. Canada affirmed its goal of cutting methane emissions by 75% by 2030 in the oil and gas sector, and published a framework to meet this goal, which included finding and fixing infrastructure methane leaks. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency will require oil and gas companies to monitor and fix leaks at all project sites in an expansion of a 2021 methane rule. And the U.S., EU, Japan, Canada, Norway, Singapore, and the UK all signed a pledge that will work to build a coalition of major oil and gas companies in these countries to support efforts to cut methane and carbon dioxide emissions. Lastly, the Global Methane Pledge, a global pact to cut methane emissions by 30% this decade, has now also been signed by more than 150 different countries.
Thanks, Gordon. I think that was a really helpful overview into the three key themes. You mentioned that conversations around who should pay for climate-related loss and damages was a key theme during the event. How did the conversations around this topic unfold?
Overall, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Scientists estimate that approximately 1.6 billion people live in vulnerability hotspots, which are areas that are experiencing severe climate change effects. And this number could double by 2050 as emissions continue to rise and temperatures rise as a result. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte said that the Netherlands will increase its annual contribution to climate finance in developing countries to 1.8 billion euros by 2025. This is an increase of about 50% over their 2021 levels. French President Macron urged the US and China to pay their share for climate damage. The former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, however, that affordability is a challenge in the current environment in order to pay reparations to developing countries, and says that private investment is needed. President Biden announced the doubling of a previous $100 million pledge for adaptation and resiliency funds and an additional $150 million for projects across Africa. But this received a lukewarm reception from developing countries who have called for more international aid. On top of that, Pakistan's prime minister sought compensation for climate damage as it recovers from the catastrophic floods that it experienced over the past year, costing the country approximately $30 billion. UN experts published a list of projects worth $120 billion that investors could back to help poorer countries cut emissions and adapt to the impacts of global warming. Antigua's prime minister says the oil and gas industry should pay a global carbon tax on profits, which would be a source of funding for climate-related loss and damage. Though these discussions have been contentious, it has been difficult to come to a resolution. At the time of recording on Friday afternoon in London, the official text includes draft language on the need for effective funding arrangements related to responding to loss and damage, end quote. So a lot to digest and get through, but progress being made.
So there were pledges related to methane emissions, but were there any other new pledges or climate commitments that came out of COP27?
Yeah, it's important to mention that there's been a feeling that this year's COP that many of the corporate net zero pledges and climate commitments made last year were a bit hollow, and critics say they are greenwashing. For example, an analysis of net zero pledges from over 1,000 publicly listed companies, regions, and cities found that many are no more than vague commitments with no plans as to how they'll track and or report progress. There were also divisive conversations over whether 1.5 degrees should remain the explicit target for planetary warming, with a few countries resisting the mention of this goal in the official summit text. Though at the time of recording, the draft text does include this language. So there weren't as many pledges coming out of this year's COP, but there were some, and I'll highlight a couple in addition to the methane pledges I mentioned. For example, the UN Food Agency aims to launch a plan within the year that aligns the food industry and farming with capping global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, and is backed by more than 40 investors managing a combined 18 trillion. President Biden also announced the Federal Supplier Climate Risks and Resilience Proposed Rule, bit of a mouthful, which would require federal contractors and suppliers in the US to align with the goals of the Paris Agreement.
So as COP27 was happening, a G20 summit also took place in Indonesia, where President Xi and President Biden renewed hopes that China and the US would work together to strengthen climate commitments, following months of tense relations over Russia and Taiwan. So is there reason to hope that the two countries, which are the top two worst polluters globally, will be able to work together on climate mitigation and resiliency?
On the surface, yes, President Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping have agreed to collaborate on tackling climate change, global economic stability, and various other transnational issues, restarting negotiations that had previously been stalled before. And I think, importantly, Xi and Biden agreed to empower key senior officials to maintain communication and deepen constructive efforts that have been made so far.
Great. It will be interesting to see how that develops. And so my last question for you. So in a reverse, there was a bit more of a fossil fuel presence at this year's COP than in previous ones. Why do you think that was? And what was kind of the outcome of this participation?
I mean, I think the real crux of the reason for this was stemming from the energy crisis that we've had as a result of the Russia and Ukraine war, and a growing recognition that fossil fuels will still be a critical component of the transition to a low carbon economy. The events taking place in Egypt and many of its allies are fossil fuel producing countries. And this is the first climate summit where natural gas companies were invited to actively participate in the official program of COP. Saudi Arabia's Minister of Foreign Affairs said that you can achieve carbon neutrality while producing fossil fuels, and they are apparently proving it in Saudi Arabia. And they have pushed to change the discussion from leaving out oil and gas from climate discussions and instead focus on how to reduce emissions with active participation from fossil fuel interests. There's still some tension over whether or not natural gas can be considered a transition fuel, and this will, of course, continue to be debated over the course of the year and into next COP. Importantly, at the time of recording, the draft text coming out of COP has softened the language a bit on phasing down fossil fuels, as it contains the goal to, quote, phase out and rationalize inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, end quote. So overall, I think there is a recognition that fossil fuel needs to be part of the conversation, and hopefully it will be to the benefit of turning things towards more carbon neutral in the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gordon. Those are all of my questions for today. It seems like leaders are going to be working overtime this weekend to finalize the final version of the official COP27 text. So it'll be interesting to see how it all ends up. Thank you to Gordon for a very interesting discussion. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter. This concludes our episode. New episodes of ESG Talks air every other week. In the meantime, please visit kbra.com to access our other podcast series, as well as our ratings and research.